So this is my reading and commentary reflection on the Platonic dialogue Parmenides, and this is part 9 of this experience. So I'd like to begin this with a quick reflection or prayer. The mind is an interesting thing. Full of these desires and capacities, or capacity, I should say. All the while, the struggle is persistent, it's constant. It is this struggle against absence, it is the struggle for productivity, it is the struggle to be aware and to solve problems, to move against the stressors of life, and to navigate in some harmonious fashion. There are seemingly no shortages of failures and successes, but what we put into it, the effort that we put forth, and the commitment that we have to ourselves and also to others, is the determinant that brings us out of the negative aspects of those uncontrolled desires and poorly allocated attention. So within the spirit of this, we're going to continue talking about oneness and being. So I'd like to read one paragraph and then reflect on it. These paragraphs have been taking some time to reflect on compared to some of the dialogues past. So, without further ado, Parmenides begins, he says, "Come, let's proceed further in the following way." "How?" says Aristotle. "Do we say that the one partakes of being and hence is?" "Yes. And for this reason the one that is was shown to be many?" "Just so." "And what about the one itself, which we say partakes of being? If we grasp it in thought alone by itself, without that of which we say it partakes, will it appear to be only one, or will this same thing also appear to be many?" "One, I should think." "Let's see. Must not its being be something, and it itself something different, if in fact the one is not being, but as one partakes of being? Necessarily. So if being is something, and the one is something different, it is not by its being one that the one is different from being, nor by its being that being is other than the one. On the contrary, they are different from each other by difference and otherness, of course. And so difference is not the same as oneness or being. Obviously not. Alright, so keeping in mind that we've covered this ground before, many times actually, and it's by exercise, by discipline, that we go over it again. So I want to go through this line by line. He says, "Do we say that the one partakes of being and hence is?" So for some time we've been thinking about the ground of being. Initially we thought about it in this dialogue as a matter of purity, that it is irreducible, that it in of itself is not differentiated, is non-articulate. And we've sort of moved more towards that point where being is now something that is sort of articulate. Oneness participates in being, being participates in oneness. It's this relationship that provides the coherent continuity that allows order and identity to emerge, to be stable, and to persist. he continues, and for this reason, the one that is was shown to be many. Now he says that it was shown to be many because it participates in difference, that we can separate out oneness or unity from that which is, or being. Again, the two are sort of intermixed in this intricate dance, but they are still two separate identities, and by that difference, we consider this to be many, or multiplicitous, more than one. And what about the one itself, which we say partakes of being? If we grasp it in thought alone by itself, without that of which we say it partakes, will it appear to be only one? Or will this same thing also appear to be many? So this is interesting, an exercise that we have gone through. So he suggests taking the one itself. So again, to give this some context, what is this one? I've been conceptualizing it as a principle. It is the principle or the concept of unification or oneness. It's related to identity in the sense that thingness or something, for it to be identified at all, it must have coherent properties that are stable enough not only to separate it from other things, but also that it itself can maintain a degree of constancy internally, regardless of the external commotion. And the principle of oneness is that thing that maintains this capacity, that maintains a certain degree of order in the sea of potential randomness that being is. So we take it in the mind, we take the principle, and we question it. We grasp it in thought alone by itself, without that of which we say it partakes, which would be being. Now it appears to be one in the following sense, and this is a distinction that we've made already. Initially, like I've mentioned, oneness and being, there really was no differentiation. It was just that purity. When we talked about sensible things, when we think about things that articulate with one another, which is everything. I could take my phone, I could take my pants, I could take the microphone. We could do the same exercise with all of these things and put them at the center of the mind, and we say, are they one or are they many? Well, it depends on the context. If we are thinking about attention and through this agentic experience of focus, awareness, when we take the phone, for example, and we say, is this one or is it many? Of course it's one. But at the constitutional level, when it comes to the principle of oneness and the being, the ground of being that it participates in, by this language, I think we would say that it partakes in the multitude because of this principled relationship, which is kind of a bizarre thing because being, and thinking about the principle of oneness when we think about one thing allows us to say that it is one thing, but there's always multiple things that are going on to make its instantiation realized, let's say. Must not its being be something and it itself something different? So let's think about this, this statement. must not its being be something? And it itself something different. So it itself is referring to not the totality of being, because if I point to an object and I say that, or I refer to it as it, if it were the case that every time I tried to direct the attention to something, but in fact what I'm referring to is all things, it would be very difficult to have a conversation, very, very difficult to identify anything. So we're making a differentiation between the principle of unity, or the identity of the thing, that is maintained by the principle of unity, operating on the ground of being. So there's two things here. Being as it relates to all things that are, and then being that is specific to that thing. Now, within the space of the relationship between oneness and being, and as it relates to one thing in particular, right now I have my eyes focused on a small fabric mouse that is meant for a toy for my cat. There are various qualities and characteristics by which that thing comes to be. Its ground of being is similar to all things. The rug that it sits on, the laminate floor that sits below that. It also participates in oneness, just as the rug that it sits on and the panels of the laminate beneath it. So the principles by themselves help us understand the structure of how things come to be separate from other things, but it doesn't describe in particular how that thing is, how it is separate, or specifically how it's separate. Now, if we take two local things, the local being and local unification, is there a difference between the two? And it seems like, since he is saying, must not its being, so local being, and it itself, local unification, is this something that's different? Now, if we separated them out into two things, then they are different. But they are married together as they are in all things. Again, following this framework. So what does this mean in greater detail? Now, before, we had gone through this conversation about instantiation of properties and of qualities. Now, although I've gone through the exercise many times, still the definition of these things seems a bit fuzzy to me. However, the meaning, I think, is stuck with me. There are various things that we can identify about that mouse that are more related to its, I want to say its structure or its form. Things that are more innate to its purpose, and in this way, its being. There are things also that we can say about it that describe how it comes to be. And of this, I have difficulty describing whether it's properties or qualities. I can't remember now. But there's some descriptors by which we would say that the boundaries of this thing are necessary to maintain its manifestation in this temporal experience now. And so we have these two different things, sort of the instantiated process and also the thing for which it partakes in purpose. So I want to run through the terms just so we have some consistency. So instantiation makes identity present. So this happens through qualities and through properties. Qualities give its character. Properties give its specific features. So in terms of a property, its instantiation of a property is the way specific determinate features like color, shape, size, hardness attach to an identity at a given time and place. The quality of something, the instantiation of quality, is the way an identity's general character, what kind of thing it is, becomes concretely realized in a particular instance. So I think this generally coincides with my non-defined description of the ways that we see the mouse. So the next thing to do would be to question where the principle of unity comes in and where its being comes in. Now these are difficult to separate. When I think about being, I think about the ground, the underlying framework by which something is built upon, let's say. It's not material reality, let's say. It's information, I think, most fundamentally. And so we have this informational landscape, let's say, of things that is being. I think the answer is generally that both of these contribute to its identity. So, excuse me for thinking for a little bit, and my cat is snoring in my lap. Now, let's move on a little bit from here, and maybe we'll come back to it once we read a little bit farther. He says, must not its being be something and it itself something different, if in fact the one is not being, but as one partakes of being? And yes, in this way it would be internally consistent, but it would be hard to imagine how you could separate out the oneness from the being that belongs to the identity in question. Other than conceptually. And again, by understanding that information left without structure, without the principle of unity, there would be identity. Well, I would say that perhaps there wouldn't be identity. What would it be? If there was differentiation in being without unification, that which is would be unstable, and it would fetter out into nothingness. But it would leave the question, well, how is it possible to have being at all without some unification, even if it's temporary? So this breaks down a bit So we understand how fundamental that relationship is between being and oneness. He continues, he says, so if being is something, and the one is something different, it is not by its being one that the one is different from being, nor by its being that being is other than the one. On the contrary, they are different from each other by difference and otherness. And this is the only subtle thing that allows this to be moved within the articulate order, whereas before the one was restricted to that level of purity within the intelligible domain and within the asensible, articulate domain. In a place beyond dimension, I say place, so it's not a place, it's a ground. But we're away from that, and we're saying, well, it does participate in this articulate order because it is separated by difference, not as sharply or as acutely as some things, like identity in general, or sensible things in general. These differentiations are very sharp, but they themselves have, in their internal structure, that closeness of relation. And so he says, and so difference is not the same as oneness or being. To which Aristotle says, obviously not. Now into the next paragraph he says, now if we select from them, say, being and difference, or being and oneness, or oneness and difference, do we not in each selection choose a certain pair that is correctly called both? How so? As follows. We can say being, we can, and again we can say one, that too. So hasn't each of the pair been mentioned? Yes. What about when I say being and oneness? Haven't both been mentioned? Certainly. And if I say being and difference, or difference and oneness, and so on, in each case, don't I speak of both? Yes. Can things that are correctly called both be both, but not two? They cannot. If there are two things, is there any way for each member of the pair not to be one? Not at all. Therefore, since in fact each pair taken together turns out to be two, each member would be one. Apparently. And if each of them is one, when any one is added to any couple, doesn't the total prove to be three? Yes. And isn't 3 odd and 2 even? Doubtless. What about this? Since there are 2, must there not also be twice? And since there are 3, thrice? If in fact 2 is 2 times 1, and 3 is 3 times 1, necessarily, since there are 2 and twice, must there not be 2 times 2? And since there are 3 and thrice, must there not be 3 times 3? Doubtless. And again, if there are 3 and there are 2 times, and if there are 2 and they are 3 times, must there not be 2 times 3 and 3 times 2? There certainly must. Therefore, there would be even times even, odd times odd times even times odd. That's so. Then if that is so, do you think there is any number that need not be? In no way at all. Therefore, if one is, there must also be number, necessarily. But if there is number, there would be many, and an unlimited multitude of beings. Or doesn't number, unlimited in multitude, also prove to partake of being? It certainly does. So if all number partakes of being, each part of number would also partake of it? Yes. So let's go through this and make sure it makes some sense. Now, in the first paragraph we read, that situation about both and 1 and 2, this is something that makes sense. I don't think we have to go too much into that in detail. The second paragraph, however, expounds a little bit. And this, I think, interestingly gets into the basics, the fundamentals of mathematics. And so let's speak to it a little bit. So again, he says, since there are 2, must there not also be twice? And since there are 3, thrice. If in fact 2 is 2 times 1, and 3 is 3 times 1. So, moving away from the obvious, the first thing that comes to mind is that when we say twice or thrice, there's an extra condition on it. We don't say when there are 2 objects that there are twice objects. Twice seems to refer to a language of happening, or coming to be, or they happened twice, or they will happen twice. And so at the very minimum, what we have here is a dimensional consideration for these principles. The second, we speak about 2 is 2 times 1. Given the fact that each of them is 1, the essence of this times is a recognition about the identity and identities, or identity in question. So we identify that there is a principle of oneness. The 2 is the distinction through difference, though they still participate in that which is 1 and that which is being, that which is. Now, if there are 2 twice, what we are saying here is that there is an instantiation of 2 things that have happened at some point in this dimensional landscape twice. So we have 2 times 2. Now, given other context, I'm sure that we can say that, well, maybe we ought not to go there. Still, this is kind of simple. I'm not sure where it's going, but all the same, we best not to miss something by its simplicity. Again, and since there are 3 and thrice, must there not be 3 times 3? If we identify some thing to be 2 times whatever that happens to be, or if we happen to identify 3 things twice, then we have this continued relationship of 2 times 3, 3 times 2, whatever. There would be even times even, odd times odd, odd times even, even times odd. Do you think there is any number that need not be? Therefore, if one is, there must also be number. But if there is number, there would be many, and an unlimited multitude of beings. Or doesn't number, unlimited multitude, also prove to partake of being? So if all number partakes of being, each part of number would also take part of it. So again, kind of a leading paragraph as to the one before. He continues and he says, so has being been distributed to all things, which are many? And is it missing from none of the beings, neither the smallest nor the largest, Nor is it unreasonable to ask that question. How could being be missing from any of the beings? In no way, says Aristotle. So being is chopped up into beings of all kinds, from the smallest to the largest possible, and is the most divided thing of all. And the parts of being are countless. Quite so. Therefore its parts are the most numerous things, the most numerous indeed. This last page here it sort of feels like I'm reading Dr. Seuss or something. And today is a new day. And like usual, a new day brings new thoughts. And so I'd like to start this perhaps with a reflection. I have no idea what type of reflection it's going to be, but I'd like to get the mind warmed up to a degree. I had a company meeting today where I sort of passively sat by and watched people present. The CEO happened to be a part of that experience, and it's always interesting to observe the behavior of those that are responsible for quite lofty things. And being of a fairly large-sized company, I enjoyed observing his behavior. I also enjoyed observing the behavior of those that went into the experience of questioning the CEO in terms of wanting, of being remunerated more perhaps, or trying to understand the CEO's understanding of how to face challenges that are to be seen in front of us, but also navigating the current landscape in terms of healthcare practice. On one hand, I found it distasteful that there were some engaged in a particular type of disposition, though I understand it, in which they wanted their concerns met because of the state of things, let's say. And there are many factors, I think, that go into this, but there's a particular undercurrent of capital degradation, I think, that is reducing the living standards of many, and it's palpable. And this experience it's difficult to articulate, it's difficult to understand exactly how proper remuneration ought to be considered in the context of everything else that is occurring. And there was a particular spirit that was alive in the CEO. On one hand, it was belief, it was faithful, it was strong, it was a message of moving forward and thinking on your feet and doing things well. On the other hand, it was dismissive to certain complaints. Now, we could boil it down to these things. I think there's a little bit more nuance and complexity there, and perhaps I'm looking a little bit farther than I ought to, given the information that was presented to me. But this is the general sentiment that I had. Now, when we approach this, and when we return to this, the spirit that I would like to have is one that is of that faithful, driving, never tiring, though subject to the periods of defeat and questioning and trials and all of this sort of thing. In the face of all of it, we have to be constant, and we have to be driving. We have to be understanding of what we're after. And the goals are ontological. We want to better understand where we are in this landscape of being and how to be placed such that we feel fulfilled in life, and that we are able to interact with others in a way that opens them. It facilitates sort of a reciprocal opening, such that the negatives that are seen within us or felt within us or felt within others are recognized and turned into something or transformed into something that is positive and productive. So with this, I'm trying to remember exactly where I was. Now, I do remember that we were speaking about this multiplication issue, and I'm thinking about this relationship to Dr. Seuss in a rather comical fashion. So let's begin with the question, so if all number partakes of being, each part of number would also partake of it. Now, first things first, in the first paragraph that we started with, when he was talking about referring to two things as both, and then mentioning adding one to make it three, and then this even and odd situation. And then he goes on to say more of this multiplicative expression, that if we have two things, we have 2 times 1. If we have 3 things, 3 times 1. If we have 3 things thrice, we have 3 times 3, and so on. And so there is this idea forming in my mind about the importance of number. That seems fairly obvious. But number, as it relates to being, number itself, I would say, is a principle, because it's not until the number is associated with some sort of instantiated thing, then it becomes relevant to the subject. Now, oneness may be relevant to a certain degree, in so far as we have to understand the concept, because one is number, but also oneness is unity, and centralization. This is an important principle. 2, we move into multiplicity, and we have again the same sort of idea. 2 as number, more as principle, something that is waiting to be associated with something that is 2, but 2 itself is partakes in being. So if all number partakes of being, each part of number would also partake of it. He continues, so has being been distributed to all things, which are many, and is it missing from none of the beings, neither the smallest nor the largest? So this would seem to be the case. The being, again, is the ground of all things. There is that structure or that framework by which thingness can be altered, changed, divided, understood, intuited. Again, he says, so has being been distributed to all things, which are many, and is it missing from one of the beings, from none of the beings, neither the smallest nor the largest? Or is it unreasonable even to ask that question? How could being be missing from any of the beings. So being is chopped up into beings of all kinds, from the smallest to the largest possible, and is the most divided thing of all. And the parts of being are countless. Therefore, its parts are the most numerous thing. So I'm not sure if there's really much to be said here. It seems like we're in a transition between where we were, not just in terms of seeing oneness and being as one thing, and moving more towards being in oneness, having a close relationship, but also being divided, articulated. And we progress from this place of articulation to expand now to the telescopic vision of things that partake of this being in oneness, from the smaller scale to the larger scale. And this is most evidently seen in numbers. He continues, he says, "Now is there any of them that is part of being, yet not one part?" How could that happen, says Aristotle? I take it, on the contrary, that if in fact it is, it must always, as long as it is, be some one thing. My apologies for that noise, but that was my cat scratching the front door. So, I know that we're on a new paragraph, and I don't usually interpret mid-reading. Usually I like to read the paragraph first, but I'm just going to go for it this way for now. Again, he says, I take it on the contrary, that if, in fact, it is, it must always, as long as it is, be some one thing. So even in the face of division, in the sense of it being a part of something, it participates in unity. And so we have this relationship between multiplicity and oneness. Oneness is necessary for coherence and structure. Difference is that thing by which the multiplicity of oneness, or the multiplicity of being, can occur. So again, obviously that noise is my cat, so I apologize. He's getting excited about this oneness and being conversation. It cannot be nothing, he says. And Aristotle responds, necessarily. So oneness is attached to every part of being and is not absent from a smaller or a larger or any other part. So again, I want to dwell on this concept that oneness is attached to every part of being. Again, my mind goes back to this telescoping view, or a Russian doll type scenario in which we have these structures that are kind of similar in character. We have the principles that are similar in character, oneness and being, and they reverberate independent of their independent of their size. But the interesting image is that their form or their structure is the same, regardless of their size. They only differ based on the size. And in the sense that they are unique identities. and he says, is not absent from a smaller or larger, or any other part. Just so, says Aristotle. So being one, is it, as a whole, in many places at the same time? So again, being one, is it, as a whole, in many places at the same time? So here we have a strong dimensional quality, because he mentions places, and then he mentions something. So again, we have to be careful, because we've already established that this relative scale in terms of size doesn't really matter. There is the participation of being in oneness in all of these, at all of these levels of participation. So being one, is it as a whole in many places at the same time? Now, if we are referring to the principle of oneness, then I would say, yes, as a whole, the principle extends into many things. Now, why is this the case? Let's take this microphone, or let's take a simpler object. There's a small little, I think it's used for tea, a glass container, almost like a shot glass, but a little bit different in terms of its shape. So in this thing, can we identify the oneness of one being restricted to a part as it is? And I would argue that because the thing is, it partakes both of being in oneness, that oneness is fulfilled by the identity of the thing, that it can be articulated, it can be intuited, it can be observed. Perhaps more importantly, it is instantiated by its properties and its qualities. There are bounds by which the oneness is. Well, I could say that the oneness is. There are bounds by which the oneness is. What does that mean? I mean, the style of the container, the material that it is made out of, the color that it is, all of these things are descriptors that bind the thing. Ultimately, we would say that it is a cup or a vessel. And it is necessary for all of these descriptions to be as they are, to bring about the oneness that is most readily grasped by our attention. But we can't limit it to our own experience and our own observation, though it is important. Because the tool that we use to measure this, to observe it, when I say measure, there are plenty, the apparatuses that we have in our at our disposal are observing this thing and measuring it, taking in light, perceiving depth, other dimensional qualities we might attribute to it if we are to interact with it in more sophisticated ways. Now, before, when we were taking being in oneness to be one thing, not differentiated, not articulated, we said that it was impossible for this thing to be a participant in any dimensional structure, meaning by dimension something that can be measured, like time, for example, is a dimension, or space or length, let's say. We could say that that's a dimension. The question is now, although these things that we were speaking of are quite foundational and principled, again being in oneness, do they now participate in the dimensions? And I would say yes, probably. And I say that because as soon as difference is introduced, that they become articulated, they become separate entities or identities, they participate in the same mode of expression that all articulate things do. And all articulate things, as far as I'm aware, are subject to measure, subject to certain I want to say ways of being seen. I could say it's an expression on their part, on the part of the things that are, because as they are expressed, they are perceived through these ways by which they can be measured. If we say the ways that they can be measured, it is much like with the glass, it's about identity, about identifying qualities and properties that give some bounds for that identity, for which it is instantiated and it is realized, and participates in a broader articulate order. So does oneness as a whole partake in many places at the same time? Now we would either say that there's an aspect of it that does, or there's an aspect of it that that does participate in many places at the same time, but the whole does not. That's one potential argument. And then the other is, because it participates in the articulate order, then it does full stop. And he says, Parmenides says, look at this carefully. Aristotle responds, he says, I am, and I see that it is impossible. Parmenides continues, he says, therefore as divided, if in fact not as a whole, for surely it will be presented to all the parts of being at the same time, only as divided. Okay, so they're taking our sort of first argument, in which there's this principled oneness by which the whole of it is an identity, and its parts are the things that we perceive when we see other articulate things participating in that principle. It says, therefore, as divided, if in fact not as a whole, for surely it will be present to all the parts of being at the same time, only as divided. Aristotle says yes. Furthermore, a divided thing certainly must be as numerous as its parts. Now it seems to be swaying in the other direction. Necessarily, says Aristotle. So we were not speaking truly just now when we said that being had been distributed into the most numerous parts. It is not distributed into more parts than oneness, but, as it seems, into parts equal to oneness, since neither is being absent from oneness, nor is oneness absent from being. Okay, so there's some refinement that we have to do here. There's some misunderstanding somewhere. So let's go back to the drawing board. So oneness is attached to every part of being, and is not absent from a smaller or a larger, or any part. So I think I made a mistake when I was referring to oneness alone. So he says, so being one, referring to oneness and being as a whole, because there are two parts. And this gets back to, I think, what we were discussing about the unity of being, because we're still identifying this concept that we had before as one thing, as being a whole, but divided into parts as being in oneness. So being one, the one in this sense is being in oneness, is it as a whole in many places at the same time. Now this changes things, I think, slightly. Or does it? I think if it is to be that which facilitates, it must be present in all things at all times. And here we see where the expression comes from, all things are one. So being one again, is it as a whole in many places at the same time? Look at this carefully. I am, again says Aristotle, and I see that it is impossible. Therefore, as divided, if in fact not as a whole, for surely it will be presented to all the parts of being at the same time, only as divided. Now, for surely it, he is referring to the one, which includes oneness in being. He says, for surely it will be presented to all parts of being at the same time, only as divided. Divided between being in oneness. Now, this is a difficult thing because it's sort of flipping it inside out. At least this is my interpretation, so let me try to explore this a little bit more. Perhaps we'll go back and make another correction. I'm not sure. But as far as I can tell, we take this oneness, which has two parts, oneness and being. If we reflect it, we say, what is the oneness, the whole, in relation to the part? What is oneness and what is the one? What is its relationship to being? It would be necessary that whenever we see being, or whenever we identify the one, which has being and oneness, we would be identifying being. We would be identifying a part. It is furthermore a divided thing certainly must be as numerous as its parts. Now we have to go back a little bit. Therefore, as divided, if in fact not as a whole. Now, if it is to be divided, again, oneness in being, not as a whole, not as the one, there is an indication that this is where it's a bit confusing. Now, surely it will be present to all the parts of being at the same time, only as divided. So the one will only be present to all parts of being at the same time, only as divided. Now this is still difficult for me to understand, because on one hand we have the potential for, if it is divided, then we have being already, and then we have oneness on the other side. And if we have oneness on the other side, then it's already attached to being. It's already related by default. A divided thing certainly must be as numerous as its parts. And this is clear. We divide the laptop. What it is made up of those parts. So, while we say that its unity of being isn't necessarily as plural as its parts, but in its divided sense, a divided thing must be as numerous as its parts, because you have many things. The identity of oneness actually restrains the things in question that we're talking about. So it wouldn't be an infinite number of things. It would be confined based on the thing that is being divided. Now this is where he says, so we were not speaking truly just now, where we said that being had been distributed into the most numerous parts. It is not distributed into more parts than oneness. And that again is because the parts in question of a divided thing are participating in oneness. It's the reference point. But, as it seems, into parts equal to oneness, since neither is being absent from oneness, nor is oneness absent from being. On the contrary, being two, they are always equal throughout all things. It appears absolutely so, says Aristotle. Therefore, the one itself, chopped up by being, is many and unlimited in multitude. And this is our second argument, that because it is found in all things, and being is so divided to be unlimited, that we would also have this oneness associated with it, and by that we would identify the whole of the one in everything. So not only is it the case that the one being is many, now why would we say that it is many? We would say that it is many because by difference, by articulation, it is found in many things. So not only is it the case that the one being is many, but also the one itself, completely distributed by being, must be many. Absolutely, says Aristotle. Furthermore, because the parts are parts of the whole, the one, as the whole, would be limited. Or aren't the parts contained by the whole? And of course they are contained by the whole. So the conjecture here, there's a lot of this oscillation, so we have to be careful, we have to be steady. So we're playing with this idea that the one is a singular identity, but also is multiplicitous because it participates in all things. And we came to this idea because being is something that is the ground of all things. And so, because of this being, again, being the ground, facilitating the intelligible framework of all that is, we also have this relationship to the principle of oneness. As the principle of oneness, so far as we are conceptualizing it, it's closely wed to this thing. They are parts of a whole. And where we find the one, we find the other. And where we find the two together, we find the whole, which is the one. But we also have this issue that the one is a singular identity, which has a boundary around it. And this boundary necessarily implies limitation. It implies difference. So in what way do we find this identity to maintain its self, perhaps within a different identity, if that's possible? Again, furthermore, because the parts are parts of a whole, the one, as the whole, would be limited. Or aren't the parts contained by the whole? Necessarily, says Aristotle. But surely that which contains would be a limit. Doubtless, says Aristotle. So the one, that is surely both one and many, a whole and parts, and limited and unlimited in multitude, apparently, says Aristotle. Now this is getting, I think, more closely related to where we were initially, in the sense that this purity of oneness is this permeated thing throughout all, although it was different, or it was non-participant in the way that articulate things were. Now we have something that's more articulate, but still pervasive. So again, the one that is surely both one and many, a whole and parts, and limited and unlimited in multitude. So, since in fact it is limited, does it not also have extremities? Necessarily. And again, if it is a whole, would it not have a beginning, a middle, and an end? Now this is one of the things that I did not think of until now, but it reminded me of that excursion that we were on when we were thinking about the first iteration of this. And the first iteration actually brought us some beautiful reflections. And I don't think it's going to destroy it here, but I think it's going to cause us to have another exercise in that regard. So I'm going to discuss this first part where he says, if it is limited, does that not mean it has extremities? And I think this is an interesting point of reflection. So first, let's think about limit. What does it mean for something to have limit? Well, he goes into it, beginning and end, that's limit. But also, it's not like a traditional limit, as we think of in terms of biological life. Because it's not as though being is limited per se. It's not as though oneness is limited per se. It's limited in context. It's limited by difference. Limited through difference, whatever we want to say. So again, this limit, the interesting thing is, it applies to what seems to be this conceptual layer of speaking about oneness. What do I mean by that? I mean, when we think about the one, again, as a whole, being composed of those parts, the principle of unity or oneness, and that of the ground of being, conceptually this one has the limit insofar as it is I'm not sure if this is the correct language, but instantiated by oneness in being. So again, just like with everything else we've described, the bounds through which something is expressed in its identity. And this concept itself is inherently limiting. We have to think about all the things that we push aside when we are just thinking about this concept. And I could look out in my apartment, I could name everything that's in front of me. And I could say that it is separate to a degree, but it's not separate in a fundamental sense, because everything that I also see is something that is fundamentally related to this whole of the one and of its parts, oneness and being. And so it would seem, perhaps, I may be incorrect about this, but at this layer for which we ascribe limits to the one, it preserves itself fundamentally, in the sense that there is no thing that does not participate in this identity. Or there's no thing that this identity does not participate in. I suppose we can see it both ways. So it's a matter of seeing. Let's think about this for a moment. So in what way are we seeing it when we say that something participates in the one, or the one participates in something else? So let's say we think about the pillow that my legs are on. It's participating in the one. What does that mean? Well, since that has the qualities of being and has the qualities of oneness, we can see how the one is instantiated, I suppose. Now, how would we say, on the flip side, that the one participates in the pillow? Well, because there are the qualities and properties. There are things that are specific to the pillow, the identity of the pillow, the sort of bottom-up expression rather than the top-down expression. But the two are not incorrect, nor are they in conflict. There are different ways by which this concept is participating with the thing, or the thing participating in the concept, or the identity of the one. So Parmenides again, he says, so since in fact it is limited, does it not also have extremities? And again, if it is a whole, would it not have a beginning, a middle, and an end? So my recording software just crashed before I had a nice little exercise, and it was about a 5-minute exercise. I lost a lot of valuable material there, but I'll try to recreate what was lost. So I was speaking about an identity. I was speaking about the pillow that my legs are resting on. And I asked the question, we can see participation in two ways. We can see the one's participation in the pillow and the pillow's participation in the one. In the case of the latter, and the pillow's participation in the one, the pillow is a finite structure. It is subject to change. It is subject to transformation. It is subject to a beginning and an end in the sense of its own identity. But in the context of the one, being and oneness continues, regardless of how it is transformed and denatured, whatever. What is changed with regard to the one is the particular type of instantiation, not the principle itself, not the one, the principle of unity and being, not the one. And so we can see by context that the pillow is something that has a beginning and an end. And by its instantiation, the particular way in which the one participates in the pillow has a beginning and an end, but not in the case of something's participation in the one, because that stays constant. And in this way I mean not that the thing itself is going to have this perpetual existence, but rather the identity of the one still maintains itself, along with its parts and its participation in sensible things continues. Now the contextual point, I think, is one that should be highlighted here. It's the idea that there is limits placed on the participation of the principles that we were discussing. And these limits are from the point of view of a particular identity in question, and not the whole, or not the one, but again, for example, the pillow. The pillow has a particular identity. It is something that participates in the ground of being. It's something that participates in unity. And so this coherence is necessary. But all the same, when we find ourselves, when the pillow finds itself coming into being and moving out of being, it's not as though being itself has ended, of course. It's the being as it relates to the particular instantiation of the identity in question. Parmenides says, if it is a whole, would it not have a beginning, a middle, and an end? Or can anything be a whole without those three? And so the question then is moved towards the one. What was the beginning of the one? Will there be an end of the one? What is the middle of the one? Now, in a way, we've sort of discussed the beginning and the ending. But the beginning and the ending as it pertains to particular things, particular identities. But what about the one itself? That particular identity. In the first iteration, we got away with without needing a beginning, because the ground of being and the principle of oneness were one thing, and it was the starting condition by which everything that was to follow, everything that was articulate, would be born of. And we had this image of a tree, and although maybe not entirely accurate, the image that was formed was, in my mind, I'm thinking about a piece of construction paper, a white piece of construction paper. And this construction paper is meant to represent everything. Now, there are limits to it, because in this sense, we're trying to establish the construction paper as an infinity. But let's just take a standard piece of construction paper for argument's sake. And what we cut into this is a grand oak tree. This grand oak tree is outlined by the white material of the construction paper. What has been cut away is not necessarily being in this context. We could say that it's transformed or distributed, but the dead spaces are not nothing, and it's not necessarily absence, but rather it is meant to symbolize difference, because now we have something that's quite articulate in a seed of being that is otherwise non-articulate and infinite in that way. And all along this tree, we have the variability that we see in the articulate order. And there were various, I think there was one instance in which we went through this in detail, and can't really remember the image, but something to do with the peripheral branches and the leaves that represented man's experience, and moreover, man's capacity and the way that he can change and transform and create new things. Now I bring that up because this beginning and ending is important. One of the ways that we rationalized our way through the beginning of the purity of oneness is that it is something that does not participate in the dimensional structure. It's not something that is measured. It's something that is. It's not something that is observed. It's something that facilitates observation. It is the very thing that allows for intelligibility. And I think that that position, that ground, is still important. And the image is still important, despite where we have come to, attempting to separate out oneness and being, while still maintaining an identity. So I have to remind myself that where we have come to is this one is now something that is articulate. It is something that is intelligible. It participates in a dimensional sense, I think. And so far, I think I've just been associate anything that is articulate participates in the dimensional order, or anything that is intelligible participates in the dimensional order, that it can be measured, in other words, or witnessed or observed, whatever. And certainly it's a part of our experience, no doubt. But the main question is, with regard to the beginning, how does the differentiation between oneness and being affect our original conception of being? And is it appropriate to keep this image, the infinity, I would have to imagine the image changes a little bit. The ground, I think, remains the same in its infinite sense. The ground is sort of what seems to be the beginning. It's the necessary point of the beginning. What comes from that, or maybe not from that, but what articulates with it, is that oneness. Because we have the separation, we have division, we have difference. And this productive capacity, or the principle of creation, to use an Old Testament principle, is that which orders and identifies. The difficult question is, if our being is now participating in the dimensional order, the language of time and place becomes relevant. Because then we would have to ask the question, when did being come into being? And here I have some difficulty. Either it's the case that being did not come into being, that there was a ground of being that was there, and the principle existed of unification. And therefore, we continue with this idea that the one was sort of the first identity. Or, I don't necessarily want to say or, I sort of want to continue just thinking about this. You see, again, we had our definition of being, or rather beginning, wound up in the centrality or the unification, the pure unification of being and oneness. So that it wasn't two separate things. In that instance, our beginning was possible because it was something that was pushed into something articulate, something sensible, something dimensionally defined. But it was from a place of being. So perhaps I wonder, the question is, can we still have that idea given this new framework? Instead of beginning now being defined as the point at which an identity comes to be, well, I suppose we can still keep it that way, but we would have to refine it. Because if we trace it back to being itself, we say, of being. Of the beginning of being. It is the point at which the articulate expression of the identity of being came to be recognized or expressed or intelligible. And I don't think that this is the greatest way to think about it. We're still dealing with these fundamental principles. The one as an identity is quite expansive. So this is where we're getting closer to the all as one situation. In the sense that there's this sort of internal or seemingly internal production of the sensible order, and intelligible, of course, within the limitations of the one, the whole of the one. That is, this oscillating harmony between oneness and being. This sort of penetrating masculine unification, oneness, and the accepting, diversifying, multiplicitous being Perhaps I shouldn't say diversified or multiplicitous in that, as it relates to being, but I could say the accepting ground, the fertile substrate by which this differentiation and multiplicity can emerge. So the beginning of the one is the marriage of the two, being in oneness. And it begs the question, well, there's a bit of a paradox, because when we think of being as its own identity, as a part, just I can think of my foot as a part of me that has its own identity, the own bounds by which it is defined, understood, intuited. And we could do the same of oneness, in the sense that it is something distinct. It can be identified by itself. And when we look deeper, we ask ourselves, what are the parts of being? We would say that it is oneness, and perhaps would we say being? Is it possible to have of an identity, the part of that thing, be the same identity? Can I say that there's a part of myself that is me? I think that would be kind of contradictory, but I think there's something close to a truth here. I come back to this image of the telescoping oneness and being. I come back to this idea of the one as a whole, as something that has emerged, in some sense, because of this telescoping, iterative, or rather repeating structure. There are a bunch of these beginnings, there are a bunch of these endings. They manifest themselves as we see them. The mind wishes to find a time before all of the things that I see, but regardless of where we started, where we ended, we have this concept of the Big Bang, in which there is some material that condensed so compactly and then exploded out in this display of being in oneness. But in the beginning, we wouldn't say that this gas, this condensing gas, was a principle of being in oneness, would we? I suppose it's possible. But again, the mind hungers for the other side. The other side being perhaps purpose, but it hungers for the order by which something can possibly be set into motion, facilitated. And I'm not sure the material causal pattern of the Big Bang is going to help us here. Let's go back to this being in oneness, thinking about being in oneness, of being parts, but also unique identities in their own right when we focus on them. I suppose at that scale, the part of being would be oneness. The part of oneness would be being. And then we would ask ourselves, what is the part of oneness? When we identify it in being, we would say that it is being. And so it just reverberates, this oscillating thing. The one that it is produced, that is produced by it, is any identity, all identities. It is that which is articulate, that which is definite, that which is subject to dimension, place, time. And so this paradox of beginning and ending it just seems like it seems circular. It seems like a revolution between this being and oneness. So Parmenides says, or can anything be a whole without those three? And if any one of them is missing from something, will it still consent to be a whole? It won't, says Aristotle. The one, as it seems, would indeed have a beginning, an end, and a middle. It would. But the middle is equidistant from the extremities. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the middle. No, it wouldn't, says Aristotle. Since the one is like that, it would partake of some shape, as it seems. Either straight or round, or some shape mixed from both. Yes, it would partake of shape. So today is a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. So I'd like to begin by focusing on what Parmenides says. He says, the one, as it seems, would indeed have a beginning, an end, and a middle. And then he says, but the middle is equidistant from the extremities. Now he's made this point before, and before I may or may not have made heads or tails of it, I can't quite remember. But it was under a different context. Now I want to think about this before we get into what he says about shape and roundness and all of that sort of thing. In my mind, the image that has been produced is kind of difficult to describe. What I have in mind is something that reverberates. So we have this sort of oscillatory, dynamic expression. I see like an off-white structure that is the principle in question. And there's this duality that exists there. A duality not in totality. I'm not saying that all that is a duality, but I'm saying that there is a fundamental aspect of that which is that participates in this dual structure, and that is being and then oneness. These two things are connected. The exact way it's connected, I'm finding difficulty understanding, but at least the image that I've been rolling with is like these two oval or semi-oval structures that share a bridge. This bridge is sort of the same continuity, the same style, the same characteristics. And so we have this sort of off-white, foggy image. And it gives us light within this sort of reverberating place, almost like a UV light as it shimmers, but very, very high frequency. So it's not like we can perceive the darkness that's there. It's just a very, very high frequency light and discrepancy. And I almost think about this as differences splitting through it at every instant. We could sort of, in my mind, I'm perceiving this sort of thing. Okay, so we have this dual structure that's very dynamic. It's vibrating. And then we have something that forms of it a whole that we consider. So we have this boundary that is around it. And right now I'm thinking of it as a circle, but it's not a very sophisticated image. If the circle wasn't there, well, let me say this first. The circle is there for ease of conceptualization in my mind, because it's there to outline or to provide a border around the parts of the whole. That really, since we've explored being in oneness quite a lot, it seems that the mind is comfortable there. My mind is comfortable there. The identity of the one is still emerging. Now, before, when we had this purity of oneness, it had its own character and distinction. But if I had to say something about this, I would think almost leaning towards an electron cloud type of experience, in which we have this sort of off-white, foggy experience that is more concentrated at the heart of the principles, which is, again, being in oneness. And then around the periphery, we could still say, let's say it's a circle. Around this periphery, there is a waning clarity of this off-white material. Now, I think that this image only really exists for the ease of conceptualization, because there are probably some issues with it. Because we would have to ask the question, well, what is outside of this identity? Are there just other ones? And it wouldn't quite work that way. I think this is sort of it's a static image of a dynamic process. And it includes all things that we perceive, all sensible things. So when it comes to this question, or the topic of being in the middle, what do we say? He says the middle is equidistant from its boundaries or its borders. What is the significance of the middle? We talked about the significance of the beginning and the ending in relation to this structure. But again, the middle, I don't think is something that we've explored in such detail. And memories are starting to come back now. When we went over this the first time, I think I felt as though the beginning and the end was sufficient to give us an idea of that identity. And I breezed over what the middle was, because I felt that, again, we had sufficiently explored the boundary, and everything on the inside of that boundary should be well understood, accepted. I come back to it now, not necessarily with a certainty that there is something there about the middle that's significant, but rather out of a curiosity and seeing what we can do to explore it, explore the concept of it. And as I think now, I'm leaning towards making the statement that the middle is as important as the periphery, or In other words, as the boundary, that which identifies the limits of the identity in question. And that's significant because the limits of the identity in question are the rules by which it is intelligible. It's the rules by which it is perceivable. It is the rules by which it is instantiated. Now, speaking in this way about principles as fundamental as being in oneness is tricky for me. I don't quite understand it. It's easy when we talk about more sensible things like a table or this microphone. But again, going back to this pillow, I bought just to give some context, maybe a bit of a mental break here. I bought this pillow to put on top of my coffee table. It's a real soft pillow. It's fairly large. And I have it here because when I read, I like to put my legs up on the coffee table. And after a while, my heels would start to get sore because of the hard surface of the table. And so I desired to buy something that I could rest my legs on. And so all that rustling just now was my putting my legs up on this pillow. The pillow is a square. There are five indentations in the pillow. The fifth, or the one that I'm considering the fifth, is directly in the middle of the pillow. So it serves as a good place to conceptualize and to visualize. Again, it is a square, it's not a circle. The question is, what is the significance of this middle to the pillow? Well, from a dimensional standpoint, from a standpoint of observation and measure, and more specifically from a a spatial standpoint, there is a relevance to the middle. I'm not speaking about the identity of the thing, really. Well, I guess we are, but not thinking about the purpose of it, not really thinking about its instantiation per se right now, but just thinking about the space that the pillow occupies. Also considering and understanding that there is an agent observing this pillow. But even if there wasn't, we say that this pillow is in relation to other things. By its relations, it has points of physical contact. I think there are points of ontological contact as well. And so along the registers by which we can say that something is in contact with something else, it would be quite useful to understand the ways in which it is allowed to participate. So for example, if I had 2 glasses of water, and I had a shared environment, like a large, or let's say a kid's swimming pool, a plastic kid's swimming pool, and I poured both of these glasses of water in the swimming pool. Well, we started with 2 separate identities, the glasses and then the water that was in those 2 glasses. But when we put them in the swimming pool, we can't differentiate between them. But if I put my pillow and my water bottle in the swimming pool, it would be quite easy to identify it. So why is this important? Well, this, I think, highlights the spatial aspect of things. In the material sense, it's quite easy to identify those boundaries. In the solid material sense, it's easy to identify those boundaries. Why is this? Because from a physical standpoint, the atoms are arranged in such a way that they are stable, and the forces that would be required to alter them in relation to something else would be quite large. So we have to imagine a liquid versus two solids, such as we mentioned. To have them become homogeneous, just like the solution that was produced by the 2 glasses of water, it would require something extraordinary to break all of those bonds, to transform the material structure into a gas or into a real compact material structure that would be undifferentiated to our eyes. It would undergo various transformational processes, participating in being in oneness, of course, but also iterative differentiation, and dearticulation. So when we have something that is so easy to identify the middle of, I think in a sense, again, keeping in mind the human experience and subjective observation, this middle point serves as a place of coherence. We could say that it's a place of centering attention, I suppose, but I think a place of coherence, I think, is a good thing to start with. And I say that because much like the margins, it serves as a place for which we know not necessarily the heart of the thing, not necessarily the most important part of the thing, but we understand its dimensions by its center. I think there are ways that we can speak of this that would be a little bit more symbolic and philosophical, but we need not go there, I think, for this purpose. So let's expand on this center point of coherence. Why is this relevant? Well, at least to my perspective, it's relevant because of the things that I can witness, that I can perceive, and that I can participate with. There's a direct relevance between the purpose, which is the philosophical center of something, I had another thought here, so this might not be coherent, but so we have the philosophical center and we have our spatial center. The two are obviously in relation when it comes to my subjective experience. The latter matters because I need to articulate with it. If I can't identify its spatial relations, I would not be able to utilize or participate in its purpose. So for the pillow, as I'm doing now, resting my legs on it, or like with the water bottle, to drink from it and to grasp it. The middle satisfies this center point of locality. Again, the center point of coherence. The center point of coherence elevates a little bit, and it's a little bit more of a philosophical term. And this gets into everything that I just mentioned about articulating with these objects. It makes me also think about the case of the former, in which these materials are reduced to very fundamental component parts, to the point that I would be unable to recognize them. And in this way, we could say that the identity of that thing is the pile of mush that we're looking at. Let's say if it was incinerated. Or in that pile of mush, we can go completely plural and multiplicitous and identify the atoms that are there and speak of them themselves. Regardless of what we do, we know that this process of the one, its influence, is within all things. And so we could see the coherence of the thing itself. And we can understand the existence of the thing, the being of the thing. So when we move all of this back to the one itself, and we say this center point of coherence, have we established enough of the relevant groundwork to say what this might be? Okay, so Parmenides says it's equidistant from the periphery, from the extremities, and he says it's a circle. This would provide us with an ease, I think, of coherence, something that's quite reliable in its, if I could say, epistemological structure. Now, looking up this definition of the word coherence, we have the quality of being logical and consistent. And number two, we have the quality of forming a unified whole. Some related terms: consistency, soundness, organization. So the middle now becomes something of a prime participant in the identity of the thing. Now, with the example that I used something that was spatial, and there are inherent limits to that, because what we speak of now is the one, which is an intelligible thing, or an intelligible thing, a formal thing. I can also say the center of coherence of myself, or the center of coherence of my cat. And the center in that way wouldn't necessarily be the point that is most center from the extremities. It would be, at least from a spatial standpoint, it would more so rest within the ontological coherence, perhaps. That would have a center. That would have extremities. My cat also, I think, would have this sort of ontological center. A being that is made up of parts, irregular in shape, but centralized in its capacity, its movements, its direction, its behavior, its sociability. So when we go back to the one, we think about this structure. I think we ought not to think too spatially, though there are spatial elements that represent this thing. If we place a pin right in the middle, in my mind it's right through the bridge. So what does this mean? That means the quality that forms the united whole is through the bridge. Or is the bridge. The quality that forms the united whole is the bridge. It is the relationship between the parts. It is the relationship between being and oneness. So, center point of coherence now makes a lot of sense to me. And he continues, Parmenides, that is. He says, but the middle is equidistant from the extremities. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a middle. Since the one is like that, it would partake of some shape, as it seems, either straight or round, or some shape mixed from both. Yes, it would partake of shape, says Aristotle. So this is where I think I'm going to leave this episode. I'll continue next time with part 10.